The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Chad Severs, and I'm the program manager with Arkansas Building Effective Services for Trauma. And we are operated out of UAMS in the Department of Psychiatry. If you joined us before, this might look a little different. We're going to be doing a panel discussion, so hopefully you're able to see our webcams and our panelists. But if you're not, that's okay. The important thing is that you're able to hear us. So anyways, I'm going to do a couple of housekeeping announcements and then introduce our panelists, and I'll turn it over to them. Let's see here. Okay, whoops. All right, so to ask a question during the presentation, which will definitely encourage you to do so, there's a question feature. It's on the right side of your screen, and you can type those in. We'll get to those when we can. And if you're interested in earning a CU, I'll be giving out a code at the end of today's webinar. And so just be looking for that survey that'll be coming to you. And I'll give some more instructions at the very end about that. We will likely record this webinar. So and just a reminder, if you want to see previous webinars of ours, you can check out our YouTube channel. If this topic is of interest to you or other things related to, childhood trauma, childhood mental health, check us out on Facebook. We frequently post there, and you can find topics and kind of what we're up to on our Facebook page. Okay. Our three panelists today, Dr. Alexis Davis is a clinical psychologist hailing from the great city of Kansas City, Missouri. She obtained her PhD from Jackson State University, and she was a founding member of the inaugural president of the Association for Black Psychologists Student Circle at Jackson State. Mixing her education and practice experience, Dr. Davis has branded herself as a hip-hopologist, fusing mental health with hip-hop culture and traditional African healing practices. And she does this all while running her podcast and business, Black Jewel, which is in its second season. So give that a listen. Dr. Tiffany Hayes is our next panelist, and she's a clinical psychologist with expertise in mental health services research, intervention development, and community-based participatory research. Dr. Haynes is the principal investigator of a $2.1 million study that is seeking to test the effectiveness of faith-based depression intervention in partnership with 24 churches across Arkansas. Additionally, she is the co-founder of the Arkansas Faith Network, a coalition of places of worship, healthcare organizations, and health researchers that partner together to reduce health disparities in Arkansas. And last but not least, Dr. Kyla Holmes. She received her PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Alabama at Tuscaloosa with a specialized concentration in children. She is the owner of Shalom Wellness Services, LLC. And Dr. Holmes provides psychotherapy and psychological assessment services to children and young adults with symptoms related to trauma, anxiety, mood, ADHD, and behavioral difficulties. Dr. Holmes is committed to professional services through leadership roles in national and state level psychology associations and organizations such as the Society for Clinical Child and Adolescent Psychology Diversity Committee, the Arkansas Psychological Association, and the Arkansas Association for Black Psychology Professionals. So I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to you, Dr. Holmes, and let you get our panel off and running.
All righty. Well, thank you so much, Chad. We appreciate those introductions, and we're just so happy to be here and to present to you all. So we just thank you all for your interest and attendance in our webinar today. So as you all know, and as you see on the slide, our title is Black Duality, Resilient and Oppressed. So that was very intentionally selected. And we hope that throughout our webinar, you all will see why we chose that title and why we wanted to focus on the duality of the Black experience, especially in terms of what Black individuals and families are facing right now. So what we hope to accomplish today, our objectives, is to discuss this content and this information using two frameworks. So one very important framework that we're going to use is just one that's around competency, right? So when we think about competency and what are the components of competency, we want to focus, that's what we want to focus on today. One being knowledge. So we hope that today you all feel like you've come away with increased knowledge. And in addition to knowledge, to gain an awareness and insight into any personal biases and thoughts and worldview that you have regarding the topics we're discussing today. So we hope that you engage in a lot of self-reflection of what we discuss. And also really consider throughout our conversation how you can apply this content and apply what you've reflected on to your work with Black individuals and families. So that's one framework. A framework of knowledge, awareness, and then how to apply it in terms of your clinical skills. The second framework is a risk and resilience framework. So this is a framework that's used very often when we work with children, teens, and families and individuals to see the types of things that place them at risk, but then also see them through a resilience kind of model. So not just a deficit model. So that kind of goes back to our title of Black Duality, Resilient and Oppressed. Is that, yes, oppression is certainly could be seen in some ways through a risk kind of framework, but we also want to highlight the resilience that exists and lives within Black communities, Black families, and Black individuals. So given the time restraints, I've said a lot, so you can tell that it's a lot that we have for you today, and we hope we can get through it, but there will be some time constraints, of course, so we're not going to do a deep dive into all of the topics that we'll discuss. So we hope that you're taking notes, because we might say some words, we may mention some topics that would be good to go back and gather more information about through articles and books, and then continue the dialogue, continue the reflection within yourself, and please continue a dialogue about what we're discussing today with your colleagues and people in your personal communities, but then also your professional communities. And please integrate this knowledge into your understanding, your conceptualization, and work with Black clients. Okay, so that's kind of giving you an overview of what we hope to accomplish today. So now I want to go ahead and just transition into specifically what we're discussing. And so given the audience here that ARBEST has, our assumption is that certainly that this group is familiar with trauma, that we're talking to trauma-informed therapists, people who are trained in evidence-based treatments around trauma because of all the wonderful work that ARBEST has done throughout the state of Arkansas. So again, so we're going to talk about trauma today. So please bring that knowledge into your thinking and your reflecting today, and then also bring in your knowledge of racism. So we'll be talking about kind of that intersection of what we know about trauma, the intersection of what we know about racism, and applying that to the range of life experiences that Black people are having right now, and how this might shape their thoughts and feelings and behaviors and all sorts of things that are very important in the very important work that we do with our clients. So we're going to bring in the panelists. Thank you so much, Dr. Davis and Dr. Haynes. And so, Dr. Davis, if you can tell us and discuss what is transgenerational trauma and how does this impact the social, historical experiences and perspectives Black individuals and families have?
All right, so let's dive right into it. Thanks, Dr. Holmes. As you stated, we're here for a good time, not necessarily a long time. So just to define transgenerational trauma, an event or set of circumstances that impact the way one heals and copes that happened years prior and has then been passed down between generations. So that's just a very broad definition of transgenerational trauma. And then I want to provide some examples of transgenerational trauma. So when we're talking about racial transgenerational trauma, or also known as cultural transgenerational trauma, we can think of that as Blacks as our first encounter with the education system, which teaches our history of enslavement. Our first encounter with who we are in the education system as being captured, as being free laborers of the United States. That then also has an impact on how you see yourself, where you see yourself, and the other isms of the society, such as classism, sexism, all of those things. You can't really talk about the other isms without also talking about race and the generational impact that race has had on a certain population of individuals, specifically Black people. And so Africans in America have to relearn and unlearn, which can then set on this path of migration. So we're talking these words and give brief definitions, and hopefully, as Dr. Holmes has stated, this will elicit some internal reflection and deeper research. So migration is a racial identity development that Blacks in America will go through in terms of relearning who we are and how we operate in this space. And that's the overview of that model. That's a really great model to be aware of when working with Black clients, because it helps to understand what racial identity development looks like from the perspective of a Black individual and not necessarily imposing any implicit biases. And if we fast forward to current times, we're seeing that in the media with the killing of unarmed Black individuals. The one that is gaining a lot of notoriety is George Floyd with that 8-minute and 46-second video. We don't often talk about the media and systemic transgenerational trauma that has occurred. Having to see that video and tons of the other videos of individuals who look like you, who may be related to you, that is also vicarious trauma. We talk about that in regards to clinician and client interactions, but that is civilian vicarious trauma, and that is something that your clients is coming into. Yes, they're coming with their primary concerns. They're also coming with some vicarious trauma of seeing people who look like them, who look like their children, brothers, and family members being killed on national syndicated TV.
Yeah.
And so I hope that that gives the definition and also some impacts of social, historical, and cultural impacts that it's had.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Davis. I feel like I just wanted to pause at the end of your last statement to just take that in, because that is something to reflect on. Well, it's emotional, right? Because we have to, that's something we have to see, right? And have to think about how that impacts the families that we're working with. And they are experiencing emotions as we really see that, seeing the people that look like them, look like us, and know that that's what that Black families have been dealing with, not just in the past 4 months. I know that that's when it's been highlighted and more in the dialogue and the national conversation, but that's been a part of the experience, the duality of the Black experience.
Exactly. And I also, just one more thing. I think this is also something to talk about with this going on, the awareness, I'll say, of what's going on currently that has consistently gone on, is bringing more awareness to the lived experiences that Black families go through. For instance, talks about interactions with systemic placeholders in this government, such as the police. That's a norm for Black families to have those conversations about how do you interact when you encounter police? How do you become non-defensive when you're around these white supremacist agencies? How do you then respond? So these are conversations that we're having by or before the age of 10. And I think that that also showcases not only the oppression, but the resiliency that we are ingrained to have when you're encountering, hey, this is who you are, accept who you are, be proud of who you are, and know how to save and protect your life. And so that's also something to be mindful of when encountering Black families and individuals in your healing sessions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Dr. Davis. Absolutely. Not only have you given us and the attendees language, right? Language and words to kind of understand the Black experience, but then also thinking about how to apply that when we are in these therapeutic spaces and sessions with our families. So if I could just kind of restate some of the language, and feel free to kind of add some that I'm missing. You talked about transgenerational trauma, cultural trauma, vicarious trauma. You mentioned racial identity, systemic transgenerational trauma, negressence, a negressence model. So Y'all, these are some language. Thank you, Dr. Davis, for entering that. This is part of the knowledge when we talk about competency. I encourage you all to do some more research regarding that, in considering how that plays a role in your understanding and work with Black families. Because just as Dr. Davis mentioned, this is something that Black families have always had to be mindful of, and just to promote and nurture resilience in the lives of children. And it could look different ways, but this is certainly kind of what's going on with Black families, definitely now, but always, really. So one thing that I just want to bring out as we discuss is one resource that speaks to what Dr. Davis has been discussing. This may have been in the newsletter as one of the resources. I think it was that ARBEST sent out, but I encourage the attendees to go back and look at it. It's through the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, NCTSN. I'm pretty sure your attendees here are very familiar with that website. But they put out a document a while ago, so this wasn't recent. I'm trying to look at it. I don't think it was in the context of what's going on now, but within the last few years, a document called Addressing Race and Trauma in the Classroom. NCTSN, of course, this is in the public domain. You can just go and Google it, NCTSN, and just put in Addressing Race and Trauma in the Classroom. It's a resource geared towards educators, but I think it's a resource that we could all find helpful. And it goes into some detail about historical trauma, kind of getting into some of what Dr. Davis mentioned, racial trauma, and it outlines the effects of racial trauma by age group. So for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into it in a lot of detail, but I encourage you all to look at it. It talks about how racial trauma can impact infants and toddlers. So this is important to keep in mind: preschoolers, school-age children, and then older students. And then it kind of outlines different things that educators can do to be mindful of and respond appropriately to racial trauma and how that may manifest within their classrooms. So I think, and let me just say a little bit, I do want to keep in mind a lot of what Dr. Davis mentioned regarding really how to think about trauma and racial trauma broadly, right? So Dr. Davis also talked about the images that our children might see, conversations that they might have, racially driven or race-based insults or attacks or mistreatment and violence that they may see and experience. And then they may experience it in a way that their parents, you know, may or may not know, right? That this may be going on in their peer groups and so forth. So let's just keep all of that in mind. That's all of what we talk about when we talk about racial trauma. It can be racial bullying that occurs at school, the images that they see. So just more examples to think about how this might be affecting the students that we work with. Times where students, I know I've had clients that felt like they've been mistreated by their teachers and mistreated by school administrators based on race, and that discipline policies have been implemented with them in a different way than their white counterparts, and they have experienced that as racial discrimination, marginalization, and oppression, and they've needed to talk about that in therapy sessions. So I just wanted to add that please go back and look at that NCTSN document for some additional information. So now what I want to do is transition into a conversation around sort of what we're talking about, but more specifically around cultural competency versus like an anti-racist therapy or approaches as practitioners. So Dr. Haynes, if you could speak to that, cultural competency versus anti-racist therapy and approaches.
So first of all, hello everybody, thank you for joining us. It is definitely a pleasure today. We all kind of know what cultural competency is. We've talked about it quite a bit in our training in the last few years, but it focuses a lot on understanding what other cultural groups are dealing with, but also having an understanding of our own cultural identity. And in recent national discourse, we've learned that cultural competency is our base foundation. But when we really are starting to talk about how do we help our patients heal from the trauma that Dr. Davis and Dr. Holmes have been talking about, there's been a push to talk about anti-racist therapy. And anti-racist therapy is the understanding or the belief that we have a role, a specific role, to be intentional about dismantling systemic racism. So systems that perpetuate the trauma in Black American communities that we as mental health professionals have an obligation to dismantle those systems. And so we're seeing this anti-racist theory become a part of mental health. And we're talking about some ways of how this practically looks for clinicians. And it always starts with the acknowledgement, but first the acknowledgement that racial inequity and oppression is a mental health issue. It's not just a social justice issue. It's not just something that's going out. It's an actual mental health issue. We have the research that backs up that discrimination and even the perception of discrimination impacts mental health. So it's not just a social justice issue. It's an actual mental health issue, which means that we have a unique skill set to give to actually talking about racism. But if you want to start thinking about how anti-racist therapy or approaches or what you can do, it starts with doing your own work. So we talk a lot about doing work with our clients, but it starts with doing your own work and examining your biases, but also acknowledging the times when you may have created a space in your own therapy room that felt unsafe. So when we start reading stories of Black clients who terminated therapy early, some of them talked about, I shared a microaggression, or I shared what I thought was a discrimination, and I didn't get the answer that I thought I was going to get from my therapist. So when Dr. Holmes talked about the perception of discrimination in the education system and people wanting to share that, and then in there may, in a good therapeutic way, you might have been trying to add a different perspective. Maybe it was something else, and that erased that feeling that they had, and it made that space not feel safe for them. So acknowledging your own biases, but also acknowledging that there may have been times where in your therapy room, you created a space that didn't feel quite safe for Black families. It also, once you do your work, it continues with listening to the voices of Black Americans. We have books and podcasts and articles and trainings, and some of those I think we shared earlier in a blog post that was sent out to the network that you can look at, and you can read some of these experiences. And so sitting and listening and sitting in that discomfort of hearing stories that don't always feel good is a part of making sure that you move from just competency to actually anti-racist therapy. And then being able to do the work to dismantle the systems of oppression. So we have to first start with the acknowledgement that our mental health system that we love and that we are part of because we want to help others is inherently and historically kind of has some racial bias. So we know the research that talks about the differences in access to treatment, where certain groups, particularly Blacks, are not getting treatment at the same level. We've heard about the misdiagnosis of African Americans, where you're more likely to get a schizophrenia diagnosis than a depression diagnosis. We've heard about the differences in treatment, where you're more likely to have coercive treatment or be institutionalized when you're a Black American with symptoms versus getting, the actual outpatient therapy, or that you're getting psychotropics that may be a little bit stronger, have more risk factors when you're a Black American versus when you're a white American. This is a part of the history of the system. We have to acknowledge that the system in which we work and are part of has had a history of racial bias. And now we have to think about what's my role in creating a place where that system is, where we eliminate racial bias from that system. And so that may be looking at how do I bring in my cultural lens when I'm doing work with Black clients. So when we're using psychological tools that have been validated on theories that were based in white America, or we're looking at therapies where we also know that Blacks are less likely to participate in our psychological research, which means some of our evidence-based treatments may also have some of those issues about racial bias. And so we have to bring in a cultural lens to be able to say, is this the best fit for this client? What do I need to do? How do I bring in that thought of racial trauma? Do I need to bring it in? And have those conversations with yourself. So I've talked a lot, but basically what you should get from this, I hope, is that when we're talking about anti-racism, we're moving from just the work that we're having in the room, and we're understanding that true healing happens when we start dismantling the systems that continue to perpetuate the trauma.
Wow. Dr. Haynes, thank you. You introduced some additional information. I just want to highlight some of the language that you introduced. And again, just like with Dr. Davis, please let me know if I'm leaving something out. Of course, you talked about anti-racist therapy. I like how you said racial inequity and oppression is a mental health issue. That's key. We need to see it through that lens. Microaggressions. If you don't mind maybe saying a bit more, do you mind diving a little bit deeper into when we talk about microaggressions? What are we talking about there?
I like to use examples when I talk of microaggressions. So we're really good at understanding the extremes, right? So that's even in mental health. People are more likely to say, I can understand the severe mental illness. We get a little bit vague in the middle. So overt acts of racism, we are all there like, that is wrong, that should not happen. But there's some times when there's microaggressions, which are subtle, implicit bias or subtle discrimination that occur, where we have to maybe do some interpretation. So as a Black African-American woman, I have recently been in a room where I was there to teach and standing at the podium and dressed professionally. I even wore my glasses so I looked more like a professor, and have people come in as a staff member who will then ask, where is the professor? Or they will then ask a student who is sitting down, who may be a white student, and go to them and say, are you the professor? And so that's that moment where it's like, wait, is this because, how did this happen? What made this happen? You know, is this a race thing? Is it an age thing? I like to think that I look pretty young, so maybe, you know, maybe they thought I was too young to be a professor. And it's those things where we have that interpretation that comes in that makes it a microaggression. It's subtle. We don't really, you can't really, it's not overt. It's not that colored only sign. It's the subtle things that Black Americans are dealing with through their daily life.
Right. Thank you so much. Thank you for providing that example, because I think it's helpful, like you're saying, for people listening and learning and trying to really see what Black families and what some of their Black clients might be experiencing is these types of things, and the stress that could be associated with having to understand what just happened. Okay. So thank you for that, talking about dismantling systems of oppression, racial bias. And I think the part that I want to pick up with is how you emphasize the importance of being mindful of this inside the therapy room, but what we can do outside of the therapy room to educate ourselves, to reflect, to do our own work, and to then also continue to advocate for the clients that we see. What I want to kind of introduce is, I want to go back, Dr. Davis, you had kind of mentioned a statement that made me think about racial socialization. So that's another piece that I want to kind of bring into our conversation in terms of what racial socialization is, and keeping in mind that this is what we're specifically talking about, the Black community right now. So in terms of what the Black community does to socialize from a racial perspective. So when we think about that, what we're talking about is this goal, that the process by which parents or other people in the child's environment teach and transmit values, beliefs, and ideas or messages about race, right? It's socializing, it's transmitting values. And the goal is to build a competency within their child around race, to give their child what they need to function and be ready for society and life. So in some of the research, racial socialization is broken down into various parts. So when we think about that, we're talking about the knowledge of the culture. Parents are giving their kids knowledge regarding Black culture, African culture, and what that means, and then preparing them for bias. So that's part of what Dr. Davis mentioned, is that part of racial socialization is not only exposing the child to their culture and to their heritage, but also preparing them for the potential bias and the discrimination that they very well might say will experience, right? Will experience. And I heard when Dr. Terrence Roberts, he's one of the Little Rock Nine, and he has background in mental health and does a lot for social justice and all sorts of things that he's done. And he has been gracious enough to come back to Arkansas numerous times and speak for the Association of the Arkansas Association of Black Psychology Professionals. And so one of the things that he said, and it stands out to me, is that we would be doing our children a disservice to not prepare them, to not talk to them about what life may have to hold for them and how they might be viewed and treated and mistreated. And so that was so powerful to hear that from him, somebody who experienced such unspeakable and such difficult times, you know, during integration. So to hear from his lens and through his lens that it would be a disservice to not prepare our children for bias and discrimination, and that is a part of racial socialization. And so those are the things that we kind of want to think about. when we think about racial socialization, promoting racial pride and promoting, whether that's implicitly done. I know in my household, as I thought about this and prepared for this, I thought about how my parents had artwork and images, and my dolls were dolls of color, our magazines, Essence and so forth, and Jet and all of that, and clothing. That let me know that Black is beautiful, you know, that I have something to be proud of, and that can lead to, and research even supports it, that racial socialization, if done in this healthy way, can promote positive outcomes in children and teens around self-esteem, depression, anxiety, anger, and school achievement. So we know, even the research supports it, that this is important for Black children and families to be mindful of and be aware in sessions. Even listen for that. Just be aware. Listen for parents when they talk about that, and to know that that may be a part indeed of how they are racially socializing their children for a reason, and to align with parents around that when appropriate. Dr. Davis, Dr. Haynes, anything else that you all want to add regarding racial socialization, and especially what's going on now around how parents are preparing their children, especially in this era when we talk about police brutality and other topics related to that?
No, I think you did a great job.
Yes, I'd agree with Dr.
Okay. So let's now shift to Dr. Haynes, what you kind of mentioned around when you talked about things to do in the therapy room and ways to be mindful of some of these concepts when we're working with Black families, but then also ways to just advocate in general when we're talking about dismantling systems of oppression. So when we think about advocacy, right, and what we can do as practitioners around advocacy, advocacy really does refer to that. How do we empower clients and families, and what is our role that we play in systems change, right? That is exactly what we talk about when we talk about advocacy. So one of the things that Dr. Davis, you mentioned earlier, was around education. You mentioned education, and I think that's a very important system when we think about our children, specifically children and teens. That's a system that they're often in. So that's a particular system where we can advocate for our clients, and particularly clients of color, Black clients. One word that I thought about as I was reflecting on how to advocate for some of my Black families, especially when I'm engaged with the education system, is around language. Language is so important, right? And so even if we bring in our knowledge of trauma, sometimes I know as providers and practitioners who work with children who have experienced trauma, we can be advocates definitely for how we talk about that, how we talk about children who have social and emotional and behavioral issues. We may hear people referring to them as bad or criminal, or they're callous, they're unemotional, they're not empathetic, they don't have any feelings, they don't have any remorse, they're manipulative, they're broken. Right? Like, so that's one way that we advocate for our children who have experienced trauma or complex traumas. We try to give people other language for how to see them. No, something has happened to them, not that something is wrong with them. And we try to introduce other language into the minds of people who care for the children that we work with. So I believe the same can be done here, is we can model language and anti-racist approaches when we interact with educators and administrators and teachers, and use just other language. So in reading a document, I kind of went through and said, and it said that children, Black children, are oftentimes, you don't hear them being referred to sometimes as resilient or competent, talented, resourceful, aspiring, motivated. Right? Sometimes you may hear language like violent, a threat, and be perceived as a threat, or a thug, right? We hear this kind of language. So languaging is so important. So that's just one way, just in how we talk and how the lens that we shape for educators. So language is a very lens shaping ability or lens shaping concept, right? So that's just one way, just in conversation and dialogue and emails and any interaction, that we can advocate just in the language that we use when we are speaking about the clients and families that we work with. One example that I remember, this was back in my graduate school days when I kind of didn't quite know how to handle these situations, but I was doing a school-based intervention, and I happened to be working with, it was a group, and it happened to be a group of predominantly African-American males, and I was talking to their teacher about them, and she just told me, she gave me her entire lens of them. She talked about them being aggressive and violent and bad, and she said that she could see them ending up on a chain gang. That is what she said in conversation with me. And that was this moment of, whoa, how do I handle this? What do I say? So at that time, I was kind of stuck and didn't know how, but in reflecting on that, and reflecting with my supervisor. So supervisors have a very important role in how we work with clients. Then it made me be able to kind of go back to that individual and follow up and challenge that way of thinking. So I think that's what we can do when we hear that. We have to be able to have the hard conversations when we need to. And how do we follow up and challenge a way of thinking, challenge your worldview, give other language, and then when appropriate, how can we address whatever is embedded within the system that shapes teachers' expectations? We do know that that affects how teachers report about the kids, is through their lens and through their expectations. That's in the research, that teacher expectations is definitely related to the view that they're going to have and how they report about the child's behavior. So these are all ways that we can advocate for and contribute, hopefully, to dismantling any kind of systems that reinforce oppression and marginalization. And we can hopefully introduce language that will dismantle that, introduce ideas that dismantle that, and hopefully more bring in a concept of resilience. So now what I want to do, we kind of talked about how to apply this to the education system. I'm wondering if Dr. Haynes, if you don't mind speaking to ways we can advocate for Black clients in other systems, such as the community and/or training programs.
I think it's so important that you talked about advocacy as being one of the ways that we dismantle system, and talking about our language being important. Because I think that when we sometimes hear dismantling, we automatically, especially in the climate we have now, we think about being a part of the protest. And we think about going and being a part of the organization. And that may not be your lane, and that's completely okay if it's not. But you as a mental health provider have unique skills, you have unique understanding and training that's important to some of our community organizations, that they would be happy to have someone partner with them. So when we talk about how can we advocate for Black clients in the community, we know that there's different access to treatment, and there's different understanding of what mental health is. And so when you can provide education and materials within Black communities about, this is what we mean when we say mental health. This is what we mean when we're talking about therapy. This is what it looks like. Those are ways of advocating for Black clients and Black family members, because you have to remember that when they go back to their family, they can't, everyone can't say, oh, I went to see my therapist today, because there's widespread beliefs about therapy that are strong within some Black communities. So providing that education and that outreach is an important way to be able to advocate and to partner. One of the other things is that we know that there's a small percentage of Black therapists and clinicians. And sometimes that happens when we think about systems that have bias that we weren't really expecting. You know, there are pipelines to get into certain places. And so we all kind of know how you get into the grad school program and how you do these things. And you hit some, you know, it helps if you have this internship or if you've done some volunteering at certain groups. Not every community has access to that information. Not every community has access to that pipeline. And so being intentional about going out and giving that information so that young Black people who are interested in being in mental health understand where they can go, but also talking about how do we make partnerships with our HBCUs so that we start building pipelines so that people in HBCUs also have the same access and opportunity to be in training programs and become future clinicians, so that we're better serving our Black clients, because Black clients want to have that, they want to see someone that looks like them in the therapy room sometimes, and we know that. And so how do we increase that workforce? And sometimes it's by that intentional partnerships with organizations, and so that we get that pipeline built. So those are two, I think, ways that we can do that. And even if you're not involved in a training program, you still can advocate for building pipelines when you know people who are involved with training programs. Where are they talking about their training program? Where are they, have we gone to UAPB to talk about what it means to be a psychologist? Have we done that work to expose those students to get them into our profession?
Thank you for that. Thank you for some of those practical points. At this time, Chad, I want to take a moment. I meant to do that a little bit earlier. It forgot. But Chad, are there some questions right now that you're seeing come through that we could potentially address?
Yeah, so one question I think y'all might be able to answer is just how do you, if you're working with a racist client, like how do you work with that individual? Do you call them out? Do you, we're kind of the helping profession, right? So what is our role now in light of everything that's been going on? Like, are we more proactive in that? Y'all have any personal experience working with racist clients, and just thoughts on that?
That's a good question. That's a good question. I'm going to let Dr. Davis or Dr. Haynes, if you want to jump in, then I have some thoughts maybe a little bit, but if you all want to jump in first.
Interestingly, I just read an article, it was an opinion article in like New York Times or something, where a therapist was talking about this very thing, like what do I do when a racist client is in my room? Do I challenge these thoughts? And so one of the things that they talked about that I'll just share here is thinking about that racism as being the same type of maladaptive thinking for any other disorder, and would we challenge that thinking, and how would we challenge it? And so if you think of it as a maladaptive thought pattern, most of us in a therapeutic alliance would challenge, push back on that some. Does it mean that you go into a full-fledged, like, let me pull out my Black Lives Matter shirt? Probably not. But however it is that you would go about kind of pushing back on those maladaptive thought patterns, you think about racist thoughts in that same way. And that's so that you do have a role and you do have the ability to challenge those thoughts in your room. But it is also acknowledging that if you're not comfortable with that yet, that's okay, that you may be building to that comfort level. And that's when it goes back to making sure we're reading books, making sure we're hearing experiences and voices, making sure that we're going to trainings that are continue to talk about this, so that you're building your comfort level up so that you are comfortable with challenging those thought patterns.
And in addition to everything that Dr. Haynes said, I would also suggest that there be some introspection that occurs on the clinician's part before attacking or investigating just from the client's perspective. So I know that with time, I want to just bring in this conversation of white fragility. So when we're experiencing, let's say, for instance, a racist client, we also have to be mindful of what are we bringing in that room that may be a barrier to that client getting to healing, or may be an asset to that client getting to healing. So when we're talking about white fragility, that's a defense mechanism employed by individuals who may practice or believe or have internalized white supremacy to avoid any discussion of race and racism, thereby avoiding any responsibility associated with microaggressions, implicit biases, and racism that may be projected. So when you encounter this client that may be coming in, it's important, one, to examine, yes, what this client is stating and seeing if that is any maladaptive coping mechanisms or thinking or cognitive patterns, as Dr. Haynes has suggested. I think there also has to be the introspection and consultation on the clinician's part to ensure that what this client is stating, the identification of that as racist, that has to be some introspection on the clinician part as well, to make sure that you're understanding not only what the client is saying, but the perspective that is attached to what the client is saying. Because based on all the conversations we've had, we understand that there is systemic oppression that has occurred to certain populations. There's cultural oppression, there's transgenerational oppression. So there are different forces that are against certain individuals in this population that may bring in some and warrant some different perspectives that we have to make sure that we're processing what we're bringing to the room. And like Dr. Haynes mentioned, the very system that we are working in is one of those systems. So, for instance, if we're looking at some initiatives like the War on Drugs campaign and the crack epidemic versus the mental health initiatives that are surrounding the opiate crisis, we can't negate those different initiatives and why they were different. And so one, yes, could be deemed as racist. We also then have to do some introspection to understand systemic oppression. So I just want to make sure that we're looking at, yes, how can we interact and deal with that client, and also how can we deal with ourselves in that room with the client.
Mm-hmm. And I think that that's great. I just want to build on what Dr. Haynes and Dr. Davis both mentioned, because I think you all brought in very important pieces of knowledge. So it seems like it goes back to we have to understand knowledge. So Dr. Davis, you brought in the power of really looking at white fragility and what's going on within a clinician, right? And then also reflecting on our own experiences, but then applying that. What's the clinical skill that we can apply if and one of those might be challenging people's ways of thinking. And so I would say for myself that yes, that has come up, and I would think just from my perspective, and Dr. Davis, Dr. Haynes, you may have a different perspective or a different experience with this, that me being a Black clinician, and if I were working with a white family, the way racism may show up in that space and how I may handle it may be different than a white clinician with a white family. I think that dynamic is different. I know I've heard white clinicians say that sometimes white families may say something with the assumption that they'll agree with them, right? And they're just saying these things, and then now the white clinician is kind of having to think about, how do I handle this moment, because I don't agree with them, or maybe I do, or but oftentimes I hear if white providers tell me, they're saying that they don't agree and they struggle with how to handle that in that moment. From my standpoint, I can tell when white families are deciding not to elaborate on a thought. And I wonder if in that moment, so I can decide to create the space for them to go ahead and elaborate on that thought. So sometimes maybe depending on the rapport I have with them, I may say, tell me more about that. Or sometimes I'll be honest that I've made the decision to kind of realize that if I feel like that'll get us kind of off too much, I'll be honest, then sometimes I may not do a deep dive into it. So that's just the other dynamic I want to bring into it. I think it depends on the race of the family and the race of the clinician and how that plays out and how it shows up. I think when I have addressed it with some of my clients, one person I think about in particular struggled with just social awareness, period. That was kind of a part of the presenting symptoms, social awareness, kind of pragmatics kind of stuff. Autism spectrum-like symptoms. So sometimes what I've just done is integrate it into the conversation we've already had, that we've been having, and that's just a part of our conversation around perspective taking. So for example, if working on perspective taking, I challenge them, challenge your own thoughts about that, think about that, and be mindful of how you're coming across to the people around you in your peer group, in your family, your community, and be mindful of that and consider and keep in mind that other people might have different perspectives from what you do. And how can you challenge and engage in introspection? We encourage our families and patients to do that anyway, to engage in introspection and to check the facts and get more evidence to support what it is you're thinking. Right. So those are the types of ways to do that. But that's what I would say, if it's a way to align, especially with the treatment goals you already have and that you're already working on, and just have that same conversation, but through a lens of a sort of an anti-racist approach still. Other questions, Chad? I know that was our answer to that question. Maybe we can have one more question from the attendees.
So one person has asked, how could white clinicians support people of color who have internalized some of the negative language stereotypes placed on people of color? What's the way that white clinicians could support people of color?
I feel like that's kind of touching on internalized racism. There may be some language that people use for that, but yeah. So maybe Dr. Davis or Dr. Haynes, internalized racism and how to respond to that.
I think in addition to everything that we've mentioned thus far, as tools and mechanisms in which white clinicians can support, in this instance, I'm going to refer to Black clients, ways in which you could support is, as Dr. Haynes has said, expose yourself to the different voices that could support that client. So for instance, I know in the newsletter and the support, one of the resources is the podcast, Black Jewel. And so the previous episode that we released is Black psychologists. So informing yourself of different Black psychologists, their treatment modalities, and not necessarily regurgitating their information to that client, but providing that as a resource to that client. And then that then also could facilitate conversation and just a way for that client to know that you are aware and that you are comfortable addressing that. Then we have to go back on the other side with making sure that you are comfortable with addressing that and that you have the emotional intelligence to assume responsibility in the space to allow that client to heal and not necessarily take on the reaction of a defense mechanism when that client is trying and attempting to process their healing. So just making sure that you are doing your research outside of the healing session, because that is just like we tell our clients, a lot of the healing is going to occur outside of this 50-minute process. That has to occur for the clinician as well. A lot of our work is then going to ensue outside of that hour encounter that we have with that client. So making sure that we're doing and taking the responsibility as clinicians, and then specifically if you have a racial or ethnicity mismatch with your client, making sure that you're doing some additional research, consultation with different clinicians, but then also taking responsibility and doing your own research and work.
Go ahead, Dr. Haynes.
I like, everything this is the good thing about being on panel with people who just, say what you're thinking. You just sit back and listen. So I will just add to that. I would encourage people that once you create that space and you do the work of finding out the information and the research, is don't negate the power of you being someone from the majority culture actually speaking about that internalized racism and those things, that those thoughts aren't what everybody thinks about you. You're not this type of person. And so when you get to that point, like it really, they talk about how for rape victims sometimes in therapy, having a male therapist actually be the one that says what happened to you was wrong is healing, because they see that person as the, this is the person that did this to me, and they're saying, oh, wait a minute, they're saying that this is wrong. And it has a power that when hearing it from a female therapist doesn't always hold. And so I would just remind you, in addition to everything that Dr. Davis says, don't be afraid to be that voice that says, I don't agree with that. I don't think that that's right, even though they've internalized those attitudes and those stereotypes, because that happens a lot when you're bombarded with these things, these images all the time, that people will internalize it. Don't be afraid to be that voice, because that voice can be powerful in healing.
Yeah. I think that that's great. So the only thing I have to add, Dr. Davis and Dr. Haynes definitely covered, I think, a good bit of it. I think I would go back to racial socialization and our conversation about that. So particularly if you're working with a child or adolescent client who you're kind of thinking is maybe struggling with some of that and bringing in some of the negative or unhealthy stereotypes and images that they've seen in media or seen on the news or seen around them or heard, then that's, keeping in mind, that's part of racial socialization, right? This idea of how to foster a healthy sense of racial identity and how can that be done. So there's a range of books. They've been out for a while, but definitely in this era when we're really focusing a lot and having a lot of conversation for an extended period of time about systemic racism, it's been a lot put out there about what are some books to help to promote racial identity and healthy ways of seeing where Black children can see themselves and understand more about systemic racism. So this might have been in the resources as well. It's a YouTube clip, and I'm trying to remember the name of it, but I think APA put it out around describing what systemic racism is. So I think it's like an animation series, and I think it says this happened in my town or something like that is the name of it. But that might be a nice way to just have conversations with kids about what is systemic racism, what is racial trauma, to help them understand their encounter. So Dr. Davis, you kind of mentioned this when you were talking about racial identity development, that now they have somehow encountered their Blackness and they're grappling with that. So just like they grapple with anything, you could help them to grapple with that, grapple with the images that they've seen, but then also bring other types of meaning into it, bring other information. So it's several books that I have in my office that's around, like Black hair, for example. Embrace your hair, all textures. There's books out there about skin complexion. Embrace all of it. Embrace all of that. It's books out there about the contributions of Black people throughout time and throughout our society. So you can bring those in and just have those available. You know, it may just be powerful just to have that on your bookshelf. That's part of all the other therapeutic books that's there. And then you see books promoting positive images of Black children and Black families. And then that's a way to open the door to that conversation. Okay, and I see we're getting close to our time there. Okay, so I think we'll wrap up there as opposed to introduce. So again, I know I said we weren't going to be able to get through everything. So Chad, I'm going to turn it back over to you for wrapping it up.
Okay. Okay, so on your screen, you should see today's code. So if you want to go ahead and write that down, the code is 3107. And shortly after we end today, you'll receive an email, and there'll be a link to a survey where you'll have to enter that code. So if you're interested in getting a CU, the code is 3107, and I'll send a follow-up email with the survey link in it shortly after we're done here. I just want to thank all of our panelists today, and I do have a couple questions came in, but I thought maybe you all might want to have a final words of your own, so we could go either way with that. Whoops. Okay, there you go.
If Dr. Davis and Dr. Haynes, if you're okay with it, I mean, in terms of other questions people might have, I'd be happy to maybe address one or two more questions. Maybe just one. Okay, go ahead.
So several have just asked, they've really appreciated this conversation and are curious, like, where else are these kind of conversations happening, you know, talking about racial trauma, mental health. Dr. Davis, maybe this is a good way to plug your podcast again, but are there other places that we should check out, look into, resources and things of that nature?
So I'll take that for a shameless plug of the podcast. So definitely the podcast, we're in season 2, and we focus on conversations just like these surrounding Black experiences, Black healing modalities in various different ways and avenues. So thus far, we've talked about Black healing through theater. We've talked about healing through hip hop and rap music. As I mentioned, we've had Black psychologists on. The upcoming episode that will be airing next Thursday will discuss finances from a Black perspective and different oppression that has occurred there, and tips and techniques on generational wealth for Black individuals. So you can access the podcast. It is BBLVK, pronounced Black, Jewel, JEWEL, and it's available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. You can also access it by the website, which is www.bblvkjewel.com. You can email me at blackjewel@gmail.com for any conversations or topics that you may want to have, or conferences or webinars. Also, Arkansas Association of Black Psychology Professionals will be having a series coming up that Dr. Holmes or Haynes may want to speak on as well, that I think will provide great resources.
So definitely download Dr. Davis's podcast is going to be a wealth of information. Another podcast you may want to download because they've had similar conversations is Therapy for Black Girls. They've talked quite a bit about racial trauma and mental health. And locally, I do just want to say that the UAMS Division for Equity and Inclusion, they don't necessarily talk about mental health specifically, but they will do conversations about race, racism, racial trauma, discrimination, and also tie that into, you know, what they call healing sessions, where they allow conversations to occur. And I know they've been doing a lot of this work out in the community in the last few months. So that's a local resource in addition to those podcasts. Black Psychology Professionals, if you like our Facebook page, is Arkansas Association for Black Psychology Professionals. You will get updates and notifications when those series come through. We'll have pre-recorded videos and some live sessions. They're going to talk about a whole lot of things, but racial trauma and mental health will be one of them. And we also had this conversation just a little bit a couple of months ago. So if you go like us now, you can see a recording of a live session that we did a few months ago around some of the dealing with the dual pandemic. So dealing with COVID and racial trauma and racism. So those are some other resources for you.
Yeah. And I don't think I have any more to add. I think that that's great. And I think you all have probably seen several resources come through. So for example, embracerace.org has been putting out a lot of webinars, and they have a lot of information on their website. Again, NCTSN has a few articles that you can look at as well. Feel free to go back to the newsletter that ARBEST put out. It was some resources down at the bottom of that newsletter that you all can reference as well. And so I just appreciate that question, Chad, because that lets me know the attendees are being mindful of furthering their knowledge, reflecting on what we're talking about. And please continue this conversation with your colleagues. That's an excellent resource, your colleagues, and the conversations you can have with them.
All right. Well, thank you all again. Again, the code for today's webinar is 3107, and I'll send you an email here shortly. And thank you for everyone for attending.
Thank you.
You all.
Okay, we're going to sign off. Y'all have a great day.
All right, you too.